If we want esports to be big, and we do, that means more players winning more prizes. Our upcoming tournament platform is really all about that. Today we have with us Louis Regis from Xborg to get his take on esports, on-chain data, and how transparency changes everything. Just a quick reminder that Ultra Chill drops weekly, and to get notified, all you have to do is subscribe to the show. So, let's get to it. So, we had you on the show a few months back to talk about Agora because Swissborg and Xborg and Ultra were working together to build the Agora DEX. Today, I wanted to have you on the show to talk about esports and Xborg because I think that what you guys are trying to build is really interesting and there's a lot of really good reasons to build the product that you're building. So I kind of wanted to lead into the show today with a question which is fairly broad, but I think very specific to your expertise. What's wrong with esports today?
Well, first, yeah, thanks a lot for having me on this show. It's great to come back again. And because I know the questions will be great and that will provide great value for the audience. So esports fundamentally, on this from a financial perspective, barely makes sense. It's just like a football team. Financially, it's not making money. At least, actually, a majority of esports teams are not making money. And the thing is, we know that if like this is not sustainable long term. Esports teams simply cannot be sustainable if they don't find better ways in which they can generate revenues. One thing that strikes me is that when you're a fan of normal sports, when you're a fan of you're a fan of a team and not necessarily a player. So independent of the player movements, you would still stick to with your favorite team. In esports, is quite different. You would move with the players. So and that means that you're not loyal to the team directly, and that means that there is an issue in loyalty between teams and fans. So these are like two very big issues, and loyalty is directly tied to the way in which they make revenues, because of course, they generate revenues out of influence. And so the higher the loyalty, the higher the influence, and the more money that they would make after. I spoke a lot about money, but in the end, it also comes back to the experience that fans have with their players. We saw a couple of experiments with chilies, with like fan tokens, but this doesn't quite work. It does work, but we can do much deeper things with blockchain, and that's exactly what we do. So this, to me, are the biggest issues. I think a third issue that is worth highlighting is transparency in the industry. So transparency in the way players are recruited in teams, but also transparencies in the way money flows within an esports teams, and also transparencies over the contracts of players. You have lots of players that suffer from this lack of transparency. You have lots of semi-pro players that can't make it to the top esports teams because there is no way to get there without having the right network. It's also a lack of transparency over the contracts. From one day to the next, you can just get kicked out of an esports teams. And quite fundamentally, an esports teams is composed of players. The only value of an esports teams, well, in theory, you would have the brands and the IP of the team, but most of the value comes to the players. So I think we have this opportunity with blockchain to build a team where players have full control.
Sports today is like physical sports today are very location based. They're about, teams, the local city, the stadium that people buy tickets from, and all of the business that happens around that. And then esports is trying to kind of like duplicate that mentality of like sports via teams which play against each other in tournaments which has like a final winner, but there's no location based business. And like the reason that esports doesn't do well financially is because you don't have stadiums, you don't have tickets, you don't have beer being sold, you don't have like all of that stuff which is associated with it. And my question is like whether there needs to be some kind of like step back that reasserts some different mental model onto what esports could be from a business perspective.
Web3 can totally change the way in which esports teams would function, and try and diversify the way they make money. I think it's fine to like replicate the events, but potentially just have them all online. I think the way in which we'll go is that ultimately fans will want to be more involved in the events, and this is what online also allows you to do. I do believe in wagering as a way in which fans can be more involved with players, so the ability to eventually add stakes on top of tournaments. Um, that could gamify the experience of an esports team from a fan perspective.
So I play a lot of chess, and I don't know like if you've ever played chess online, the way that that works. But like if you go to like chess.com and you play with other people online, you level up, and eventually you make it to the point where you can play in bigger and bigger tournaments. And I'll be honest that the way that they have all of that set up feels much more of a fair and even playing field than anything that I've ever experienced with, like CSGO or any other competitive gaming which happens online. So what you were talking about before, where, you can get to be like a moderate level player and then you hit like a ceiling, right? You don't have access to being able to play at the pro level, at the team level. So there's nowhere for you to go, but that doesn't exist within the chess ecosystem, because there's always money games that you can play in. Poker's the same way, for that matter, where you can like join small level tournaments which eventually filter the best players up to the high level tournaments. And I think that that's something which has been like dramatically missing from the esports and gaming industry, where there's no like kind of like low level, mid level, high level, pro level kind of discrete sectioning between the way that tournaments are played. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, that's very interesting, because that's exactly what we're doing. Is we've looked at poker, and try and understand the way in which it works, and I respond as a response to that, formulate a league that players could just join. This will be bound with G2 identity, so we can track on chain on which sort of rank or level you are within the league, and you would be able to climb the ladder up to the top, and then eventually qualify to enter an esports team. I think why this wasn't implemented is very simple. That's because um, you have team sports vs individual, well, individual gameplay, just like chess or poker, which makes things way simpler when it comes to assessing the skill of a player. Within an esports teams, you have individual skills, but also um, how is your how do you do with your teammates? Psychology would also play a role, which we can't just qualify quantitatively. Um, but I still think that there are ways in which you can have a smoother experience from going to amateur to semi-pro to pro, with a league where climbing up the steps would be directed with your gaming experience and your, directly your gameplay data. What we're doing on our side to help in this regard is, as I said, having a league where going from level 1 to level 2 would be directed with G2 identity. And we would directly look at your so two things: your in-game data and your stats from competitions. Um, Actually, we have a pretty big release that will be next week, where we have our Quest beta that would go live, and that's where
Congratulations.
you'll start to build up your digital identity. Um, in parallel to that, we have like a gaming league that will also come out in November, where you will be able to track your performance on chain over several tournaments, and as a consequence or as a result, you will be able to climb up different levels. And what we're trying to set up in the background, but that's not very easy, is to make it so that if you're like rank 5, you can have access to top esports teams.
What other types of on-chain data do you guys want to push on-chain contracts?
Yep. So yeah, the first base layer for us is the in-game data. There are a couple of ways in which we can do this. I mean, as you know, if you go on Steam, you have like achievements, and so the beta is connected to the Steam's API, and other API providers in gaming, notably like PSN and Xbox Live, where you can simply just bridge your data over. What's interesting is then you can pull the data from different places, and as you said, just be an aggregator of in-game data. And then you have like continuous data that we track, which are what we call Quest. So there are two things about us. You have the bridge and you have the Quest. Bridge is bridging what's already existing in Web 2 over to Web 3, and the Quests are what we actively track via our data stream from the different games we support. And that's very important because then that allows for hiring to be happening in a smoother way. Also, the league that we've just discussed, and this is the first base layer, um, upon which then we can build and add other components on chain. I don't believe we should add everything on chain. It's just what's useful. Um, yes, the players' contracts. Um, like one thing that we did not announce is we'll push our first initial team offering, so the first decentralized esports team. Um, in the well, it's all relative, but it's going to be happening soon. We expect it's going to be before the end of the year, and so that means that we'll put the ownership of an esports team directly on chain, where it's going to be presented by a token, just like a DAO, really. And the token that you'll purchase, as underlying, you have the player's contracts, which means that the player contracts within the DAO will be on chain. So you see, what is the revenue split between, if you win a tournament, how much of it goes to the player vs how much of it goes to the DAO. You also see the terms of the contracts, which are important for both the DAO but also for the player. So you see what's the expiration date of that contract. Why we're doing this is because we believe that this will enable us to then transfer contracts between teams much more easily. We understand that quite a lot of parties want to have decentralized esports teams, and we envision a world where you can have transparency over contract flow of players. So if you want to buy out a player, you can see the terms of a contract, and that's available for everyone, and you can see all of the transfer of money within the ecosystem. So you'll have, two more things: is the ownership of the team is on chain, and then the contract of players is directly on chain. One thing that we've hinted at is the partnerships, but that's going to come it's going to be, I suppose, late next year. But as you know, the major part of revenues in the current context of esports teams are driven by sponsorships and advertisements. Um, for us, there is an opportunity to tokenize those partnerships as a way in which we make it more fair for both the DAO that would own the advertisement pass sales and the partner directly. What we mean by this, I mean that's a new concept, so it's fairly hard to grasp at first. It's pretty much what Sandbox is doing, where you can buy land pass sales and have your brands be attached to it. Well, we envision to do the same thing, but not for land pass sales, but for marketing pass sales, where all of the marketing touch points of a decentralized esports teams would be tokenized. And on the other side, that means that a partner could purchase any of those marketing pass sales and tie their name to it. So it could be the T-shirt of the team, it could be the Twitch banner as well. What's interesting is then the underlying data of the pass sale would be available on chain. So it's pretty much means that the all of the underlying data of the partnership deal would sit on chain. That means you could see like how many views does the Twitch banner get, because the goal is that all of the impressions would be stored in the metadata of the parcel. So we can add way more quantitative data on a partnership. I'm not sure this was clear, but these are some of the
That was super clear and super interesting. So, as somebody that really likes to dig into statistics and analytical data, when you talk about putting all of that stuff on chain, what you're actually saying is making it public. And from my experience with blockchain stuff, generally when you make that stuff public, some third party goes out and builds some sort of analytics or statistics platform which displays it for people to see, which from my perspective as somebody who would be interested in that kind of ecosystem, I would be very, very interested in being able to see which teams make the most of money via their marketing, how they're successful, why they're successful. That's a really interesting rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, no, it is. But that's as far as technical aspects are concerned, that's by far our biggest challenge. Um, I mean, we run like a POC that would on Twitch that would use the Twitch API and plug whatever banner was connected to our Twitch panel Twitch channel, and then just stream that data over to the metadata of a given NFT. So we pretty much attach the analytics of a stream back to an NFT that would then have value. Because one thing about esports as well is it's fairly hard to assess what are the views or like what's the impressions that you get from a team, and that would bring further transparency. And why we need this, I mean, why we want to do this is because we envision Xborg to become the place where you can launch your decentralized esports team, and it would eventually imply that you raise capital at some point. And what's interesting is prior to raising capital, you would have so much data on the team because you would have the underlying team performance via the players with their digital identity, but also their marketing data. So you see the type of impressions that they get. And what's interesting is we can make it so that it is very transparent. We receive lots of decks our way for like sponsorship opportunities, and I'm sure you guys do too, where it's very hard to understand if the data is correct or not. One could just say, hey, we have 2 million impressions a month, but you have no way to prove this.
Right.
Whilst if you have a smart contract that would issue NFTs that are tied to verifiable um, social accounts, or you can verify the authenticity of the API is key, so you make sure the data that is streamed is clean. then you have much more visibility. And when you're from an investor perspective, you know what's the marketing reach of a team, and then as such, you know what are the sponsorship deals that you could get from this team. And yeah, we believe this could not only be applied to esports, but also other models um, where the revenue is tied to the impressions that you make.
I was actually just thinking about that. That like when you talk about going out into kind of like a wild west crypto ecosystem, like we all kind of are part of right now, and if you want to go and invest in a project, you do your due diligence as much as you can. But frankly, it's really difficult sometimes to know what's true and what's not true. And being able to have that type of data, like what you're proposing here, I think as like a very generalized solution would be very interesting from an investor's perspective, but also for a regulator who is interested in ensuring that the people that are investing their hard-earned capital into a project which they believe in, to make sure that people aren't being duped, I think is super, super valuable. Really interesting technology.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, again, challenge is well, we know technically with like some providers it's possible, but how do you make it so that it's because we can, we'll apply it to our first decentralized esports team, but how do you make this at scale? That's, I would say, arguably, technically, that's our biggest challenge now.
Yeah, scaling is always a very difficult challenge. Lastly, I wanted to talk about how utility is created from a transparent system like what Xborg is building. What kinds of utility are you most interested in at Xborg?
Um, well, we want to be the powerhouse behind decentralized esports team. Um, so the kind of value that we want to bring is we want to empower players to create their own team in a way that is effortless. Um, we want to give back the power to the players. Um, and at an esport level, we believe that, and also, I mean, widely speaking, in marketing terms, things have shifted from being brand focused to being individual focused with like the trends of influencers, and we think that the next big esports teams will be led by players and not necessarily corporate structures. And so we want to be this party that enables the creation of those teams, um, where they would be able to own their data and then raise capital, coordinate the actions of their team, be close to their fans, and have governance that is guided by a token, but eventually sold on tokens that you get by your in-game data or your community engagement. That's the kind of utility we want to give. Um, Also, we want to. I mean, these are on separate topics, but so we've covered a lot about esports, but we also think that players need to be able to invest in games early on. When it comes to in, investing in Web3, Web3 gives this ability for people to invest in games that in Web2 they would otherwise not be able to invest because there is no vehicle like tokens or NFTs. And we want that players have access very early on to some of the best gaming projects, which we do via our launchpad, which we launched about I think 10 days ago now. And that's the kind of utility we want to give to both games and players, is because when games seek to raise capital, they want to get so-called smart money, but we think the smartest um, money is money coming from players and from your end user at the end. So we want to give that possibility for games to target via our launchpad specific players that are tied to their digital identity. So if you want to raise with FPS players, you can do it via our protocol. And same, like we want to give access to FPS players to invest in games that are likely to play, and that's our FPS, FPS games. And then just I think data is important. That players should own their data, have them on chain, so that they can leave a trace and eventually have access to deeper utility within our ecosystem, like access to the launchpad, as I just said, but also access to the league where they can climb up the ladder and eventually get to the highest ranks in an esports team, or in esports in general. So that's the kind of utility that we are bringing, and yeah, that's it.
Louis, as always, I wanted to thank you for your time and your expertise. Always a pleasure, man.
Well, it was great to come on the show. Thanks for having me.